Okay, so I think we get started. So firstly, a very warm welcome to this webinar on inclusion and diversity. So thanks very much indeed for joining. Clearly a very topical subject, but also a very important subject. So thanks very much for joining. Next slide, thanks, Holly. So before I talk briefly through the agenda, just some quick introductions. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Steve Wims. I'm Society Business Director and I work in Elsevier's Journals Group. I'm also known as STMJ, which many of you will be familiar with. And I'm delighted today to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Holly Falk-Krzesinski. And you can see here that Holly wears many hats, including co-chair of Elsevier's Gender Equity Taskforce, and she's also a Vice President of Research Intelligence. So thanks very much, Holly, for joining us today. Next slide. So yeah, brief introductions. I've given a very brief one there. Holly will introduce herself as we move on. And the main focus of today really is to give you an overview of Elsevier's data-driven efforts, looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And good to focus on the data element there. And anyone that works with us will know that we're very much data-driven as a company. And also keen to look specifically at the self-reported diversity data in editorial management, which many of you will be familiar with, having had discussions with your publishers, but we're going to touch upon that. Then we've got the questions at the end. And on that note, I should say that the session is being recorded. And what we would do is after the event, we would then send it out as a Society's Update article that you can then access the recording. So do keep an eye out for that. And as we move forward, your audio will be muted. But what I do is encourage you to use the chat function of Zoom. And Holly will go through her presentation, her slides, and at the end I will come back in with other colleagues and we'll pick up your questions then. So please do ask questions as we go along. So with that, Holly, delighted to hand it over to you. So over to you.
All right, thank you. I like to start by framing things, why are we talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity in scholarly communication, publishing, and the research ecosystem more broadly? The fact is that the science that gets conducted to address societal challenges really requires the inclusive contribution of diverse researchers so that we, that is publishers and others in the ecosystem, can deliver equitable impact. And so diversity and inclusion across multiple dimensions of the research ecosystem ensures a number of things to get us to that equitable impact. From our perspective at Elsevier, we contribute to this equity effort by promoting and driving diversity and inclusion in research globally through a data-informed and evidentiary approach that drives a coordinated set of actions and initiatives, aka our action plans, through collaborative and transparent engagements. That's what I'm going to be focusing on today, is just focusing on those data-informed and evidentiary approaches that we've taken in a number of activities, and then a deeper dive into the most recent one, which is about being able to capture self-reported diversity data for journals within Editorial Manager. Now, as Steve has already alluded to, there's a great importance to data. Here on the left, I'm going to tell you, and this is some of the information I'm going to show you first, is the approach that we've taken for large-scale sciencemetric or other types of large-scale studies. These studies generally use our Scopus publication data, and we partner that with a gender predictive algorithm that's provided by NameScore API. So these things, and I'm going to show you some examples of our global gender reports, our UN Sustainability Development Goals gender study, and we've done some work on the effect of COVID pandemic on women. This approach uses an inferred binary gender assignation methodology, which, while it has some shortcomings, is great for assessing trends and change over time. And it's really a powerful approach for meaningful context. And our goal is to be able to examine gender and intersectionality in the not too distant future. Then the other approach that we're taking, and I'll spend about half of the time today talking about, is self-reported user data. This allows us to be intentional and collaborative and aligned with our communities, so that what we're asking is reviewers, editors, and authors to self-report their diversity data in the editorial management workflow system, which for all of your journals is Editorial Manager. and then use that to provide reporting that supports goal setting and decision making. So an evidentiary platform for thinking about DEI in individual journals. Oops. Now, we've done this to a large extent in thinking about data analytics because we have, since 2015, been producing a number of gender analytic reports. You can see some of our older reports here. In addition, Elsevier is one of the partners on the biennial European Commission She Figures report, and we are currently in the process of working with the team to update those figures for the next 2024 report as well. Now, our most recent report, called The Researcher Journey Through a Gender Lens, you'll see that we focus a lot on quantitative analyses, and this allows us to investigate things like researcher participation, their contribution, and career progression through a gender lens. And we do this using our Scopus database and the metadata therein, and then, as I've already explained, our gender inferred methodology, which is supplied by NameSource. This has allowed us to do things like evaluate the proportion of women among researchers overall. And in the report, where you'll find far more detail on all of this, is that we were able to see that the gender ratio among active authors is higher now than in the past. We would have hoped that would be the case, but we actually can quantify that. And all the way on the left-hand side, you see the median of all the countries and regions that we examined in the report in an earlier time frame compared with a much more recent time frame. And you can see that there's actually, looking at this through a quantitative lens, is that you can see that there's differences between countries, right? So here we have the US, and here's the European Union, and there's unquestionably Japan is way behind. The same kind of data analysis that is able to show us that across different disciplines and see what's happening. And this data analysis was able to demonstrate that the physical sciences has had the slowest growth in women's overall participation. And so you can see here engineering as a representative of the physical sciences compared with the health and medical sciences, the life sciences, and the social sciences change as well. It's also allowed us to look at trends over time. So we were able to investigate grades. So we can look at increases of women's participation. We can look at that by region. We can look at that by disciplines. But what happens to those women over time? And this approach to using data allowed us to also examine the rate of publishing and when women are leaving research. And what we found is that women cease to publish at a higher rate than do men. So while there are some gains in women's overall participation, there's also some drop-offs. And so it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Some really interesting things. We're able to do more complex studies with this data. Well, I'm not going to go into detail. It is, of course, detailed in the full report. We were able to do network analyses and look at not just the participation, but the inclusion of women in science. So the process of science getting done. And in this set of analyses, we were able to look at the gender composition of collaboration networks. And what we found in a nutshell is an example of homophily. That is, men and women tend to collaborate more with their own gender. So men tend to collaborate more with men, and women tend to collaborate more with women. And so while we see that participation is advancing for women, inclusion is not. Women are still being kept out of both informal and formal network structures. Now, switching gears a little bit, that's looking at the nature of the research and the authors, so the research workforce. We've also taken a data-informed approach to look at the nature of the research itself. Importantly, in this case, the extent to which sex and gender analysis were conducted as part of published research. And for this, we then use full text from Science Direct, which is the platform upon which all of your journals are published as well. And then we mine the articles method sections to identify studies and research that focused either on women and female subjects, men and male subjects, or both sexes and genders. And what you can see here is using this data approach and Science Direct is that and the example for this study that we looked at were papers on Alzheimer's disease specifically. What we found is that less than a third of the studies used both male men and female women subjects. So that's just this little overlap here, where the proportion of Alzheimer's disease research was much more reflected in terms of male and men research subjects by comparison with women and female research subjects. And importantly, we could even dive in deeper with this data and look at the analysis and the model systems. And what we learned is that it's the animal studies that are driving this skew. So if we look at all research by comparison with animal versus human research studies, what we see is that in the animal models, there's considerably more male men only studies by comparison. And this really skews. But of course, the problem is, and we see in, for example, UN SDG 5, that there should be better balance of both gender and sex participation in research studies. And this tells us an area of research. We're looking to extend this study across all of Science Direct. It's just that it's fairly large. So this just gives you an idea, though, of we can look at the research workforce, and we can also examine the nature of research itself, which we continue to do by looking at the UN Sustainability Development Goals, or SDGs, and examining the extent to which sex and gender research was considered in all of the published studies. We've now got this article published in PLOS One, originally as a preprint on SSRN. But what we looked at was the share of SDG-related publications. So all of the corpus within Scopus that represents SDG research, and then look to see whether or not those articles included some sort of sex and or gender considerations. What we learned is that, not surprisingly, SDG 5, which is the one focused on gender equality, there were 95% of them did. And good health and well-being to a lesser extent, and then you see that it drops off pretty considerably. What's really important about this, especially look down here for SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, there's a lot of differentials as to how women and men consider things like sustainability and climate change. And so not taking into consideration sex and gender can be a barrier to meeting the SDG goals. Now, taking this more into the way in which we conduct business and the processes at Elsevier, let me show you how our colleagues, so in the journals group, but thinking about the Elsevier sponsored conferences that we host. So starting back in 2015, our colleagues decided to start actually measuring the number of men and women not participating in the conference, but those who were invited speakers. And this matters because attendance at a conference is a very different activity than serving as an invited speaker at a conference. Essentially the same kind of differential as whether or not you are publishing a paper in a journal or if you are a member of the editorial board of the journal. So we started evaluating this, and you can see all the way in the upper left-hand corner is in 2015, men made up almost 83% of the invited speakers. So upon seeing this, the goal was to share information with all organizers and with the publishers who are sponsoring the conferences with their partners from the research community, and just indicate we'd like to have greater diversity along the gender dimension of our conferences with regards to invited speakers. So when you are thinking about the pool of people and starting to make invitations, please check and see whether or not you have women as well as men. Now, one little shift that's starting in 2022, we shifted the schema. So this schema all the way through here was using a female-male legacy schema, and then we switched to man, woman, non-binary, and prefer not to disclose. So this is slightly different. You can think of adding up the woman and non-binary, which is a really, really small sliver that you can't actually see here. And those will offset that. We've also given the opportunity for people to say prefer not to disclose, which means that we are better aligned with GDPR. We didn't quite make our targets, and this is important. We've got this data, and that allows us to assess whether or not we have reached the goals that we set for ourselves. So we use this data to set some goals for 2022 and evaluating and transparently showing, and this was shared with all conference organizers, that we didn't meet those goals, which then affords the conference organizers, their publishing partners, our director of conferences, to think about the things that we can do to drive even greater gender diversity going forward, and thinking about what our next set of goals. Again, using an evidentiary approach for an action plan. Oh, this just gives you another view of that. So while we didn't meet our goals, you can see that we have been making progress towards parity in the conferences. And this is a good feeling, right? We've also shared this data, and instead of seeming like an overwhelming goal, people start to see, the organizers of conferences, this is something that is actually attainable, and I can get credit for speaking about greater diversity or for advancing greater diversity at conferences. Now, similarly, as I've already said, there are different kinds of roles within journal publishing, and assuredly serving as a member of a journal editorial board is quite different than serving either as a reviewer or being an author with an article published. These, just like the conferences, are invited positions. They represent senior leadership within the research ecosystem, and therefore afford opportunities to drive change and serve as the catalyst or control point within the research ecosystem to drive greater change. So we've made goals with regards to diversity along the gender dimension to begin with, then we'll be expanding on all of our journal editorial boards. And this just gives you some data all the way through February of this year. We'll be overhauling this reporting. We'll have a new dashboard. We realized that there were some data issues that we had, which have all been rectified now. So we'll have a more new, robust data dashboard that we'll be able to share. But importantly, what we did is made sure that first looking at the different boards, is that we're first asking that the editorial boards make a pledge with regards to increasing diversity on journal editorial boards. And we started with a lower target and then going up to 80%. This is where we aim to be for the end of 2022. So we were almost there. Here's an example of one of those pledges. And then we can use this data for individual journals to help assess where we're at on the journey towards reaching the goal, or have we reached or exceeded the goal, and being able to report on that data. All right, so that brings us then to the bulk of what I want to talk about today, is how we're shifting from thinking only about gender data and editor roles, but thinking more broadly across gender and intersectionality, specifically including ethnicity and race dimensions of diversity as well, and doing it in such a way where the data is being self-reported by editorial board members, reviewers, and authors, and they're doing so within the editorial management system. And in this case, it's Aries Editorial Manager. Now, importantly, all of this work has been conducted in the context of the Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing. This is a collective action group originally convened by the Royal Society of Chemistry, which is now 56 publishers large. And many of them may not be individual society publishers, but it may be that their publishing partner, for example, Elsevier, as all of your publishing partner, is an active participant. And in fact, Elsevier took the leadership role and have been spearheading this initiative over the last 2 years. We started where we were all already engaging, and that is with the gender identity, and thinking, how can we do a better job of collecting gender identity data in a self-reported manner? So we updated the schema for gender identity. And on the right-hand side, you can see the ways in which we took what we had was legacy that usually just said something like gender, and then it just offered the options of female and male. In some cases, in some systems, it said, I prefer not to share, or something like that. But we realized we needed to rethink all of this and not be tied or anchored to legacy schemas. So we actually spent 6 months on just getting to this little box here, where we now have an explicit term. So we talk about gender identity rather than gender more broadly, because that's a pretty amorphous and colloquial term. We have a specific question that we're asking. We switched away from using terminology that generally refers to sex versus gender. We've made sure that there is an option that is not on the binary, and that's really important, this non-binary or gender diverse. And then really importantly, to indicate that people do not have to disclose their diversity data. In the case of gender identity data, it's considered personal data by GDPR. And then some more detail about why we're asking these questions, why we're asking for people to self-report, and then information and linking to the privacy policy. So this schema was actually endorsed by the Joint Commitment and then by Elsevier's external Inclusion and Diversity Advisory Board, and we began to implement this. But as we began to implement this, and everybody was so thrilled with the work that we did on gender, immediately in the Joint Commitment Group and within Elsevier, it was, well, can we extend this effort to data collection, self-reported data collection for race and ethnicity identity data? Naively, I said, sure, of course we can at first, only to realize almost immediately that extending this kind of effort to race and ethnicity comes with considerable complexities. And that's what we've been working through the better part of 2 years. There's a tremendous amount of schema variability for race and ethnicity. Most of the time, there is an anchoring or a focus tendency to use whatever the National Census Bureau schema or schemas are. And if you just take a look at the US versus the UK Census Bureau schema, you'll see that there's really significant differences between those. Moreover, race and ethnicity data are considered sensitive personal data by GDPR, which is different than gender being only personal data. Not only that, humans tend to have greater sensitivity to race and ethnicity demographic data compared with gender. And overall, the more questions you ask about diversity demographics, the less likely people are to answer any of the questions that you've asked. So before moving on, we went and sought out, as we do, looking at data and the evidentiary basis. We sought out and were able to secure an external subject matter expert, Professor Ann Morning at New York University. She's a global census expert consultant. She is also a sociologist and demographer. And then we worked with the Joint Commitment. Through most of it, there were 53 publishers that represented about 15,000 journals total, and then a process of iteration with both internal and external stakeholders. But importantly, we needed to speak about what we were doing for race and ethnicity as well as gender, that it was never our intention to devise a single objective or prescriptive truth about researchers' race and ethnicity. Rather, we were looking to create schemas that would resonate with stakeholders around the globe. So these are researchers in a way that they are willing to self-report their gender, race, and ethnicity data. And then we have to think about and paralleling that to the scale of diversity that we can practically accommodate, such as on editorial boards. And then importantly, GDPR says you cannot capture data that you don't intend to convert to actionable output, which means that we couldn't have come up with a list of 20 different diversity dimensions and asked about that, because it's highly unlikely we would have been able to action but a couple or 3 to begin with. So we developed a set of draft schemas for race and ethnicity. We decided to separate these out, so a separate one, 2 questions, one for race and one for ethnicity. But even after we were done working with our subject matter experts and the Elsevier external groups and active participation by about 12 publishers really regularly, we said we still need to, the idea is to ensure that researchers will find these schemas that we've developed and done so in a purpose-driven manner that they'll be comfortable with them, that they'll answer. So we conducted a very large scale survey. I'm really pleased that Elsevier was willing to contribute from our customer and market insights research team, who also brought on an external evaluation group. We developed the questions for the survey iteratively, including with our external subject matter expert. And we have a member of Elsevier's team who's an expert in trust. And then sent out a survey to a pool of about 100,000 global active authors or researchers that were randomly drawn from the Scopus database. That meant we could be publisher agnostic and broadly representative, and then close the survey when we got about a little over 1%. We asked respondents to answer the draft ethnic origins and race questions, and we did provide some additional write-in options. But we also asked people to comment on how well represented they felt within the ethnic origins and race schemas that we provided. And we asked them how comfortable would they be sharing their race and ethnic demographic information when they were serving as a member of that editorial board, reviewer, or author. And we did enable some free text for that so they can provide comments. Then we shared the results of this, and we did more iterations on the schemas for gender and race and ethnicity, finalized that and endorsed it about a year ago through the Joint Commitment Group. But let me just show you some of the feedback that we saw from the researchers, the very researchers who serve as the editors, reviewers, and authors within your journals. We saw a really high rate of self-identification and pretty significantly positive feedback. So here, when we said, I feel I am well represented, what we saw is that a really great, to a large extent, like about 30% of the people felt that they were really well represented, and another who thought they were well. So this is about 2/3 of the respondents, right, felt that they were well represented. We did see some who are in the neutral. What we learned from our evaluation is there's a tendency that when people are neutral, there's a tendency for them to be more positive rather than more negative. And then we just saw the ones that not feel represented. So for ethnic origins, it was about 9% of the people overall who said, I'm so sorry, there's some sensitivity I'm struggling with clearly. And some people said they disagree that it is, but still, even though about 9% of the people disagreed that they're well represented, they still answered, 94% of the respondents selected an option that was not other or prefer not to disclose. So even if they felt not well represented for ethnic origins, they still picked one of the options that we provided. For race, it was a little bit higher in terms of people feeling that they weren't well represented and who selected other or prefer not to disclose, but still 89% of respondents selected some option. And when we asked about their comfort levels of sharing ethnicity and race data, well, they said at about 50% overall, so these are the green, about 50% of the respondents said that they would be comfortable. Only about 1/3 said that they would not be comfortable. And we saw slight differences between whether or not you were a reviewer, a member of the editorial board, or an author. Not surprising, authors seem to have a little bit more hesitancy, probably concerned about things like potential for bias. And this information provides us a tremendous amount of insight, not only for being able to iterate the schemas and getting us to a final version, but also to think about the communication plan that we would need to have in place and what we would need to do to assure respondents that we are providing security and privacy of their diversity data. Now, the other thing that we were thinking about is the actual system architecture and where the data is collected through Editorial Manager. Now, EM is an incredibly robust and secure system. And so, for example, the framework within EM, the APD, the additional people details, you could use that functionality and add in diversity data questions. And in fact, Aries had a couple of clients that were doing just that. But we wanted to investigate really carefully to ensure that we could best safeguard our users' identity data. And what we discovered is that there weren't sufficient security measures and access controls in EM and the APD that we felt comfortable. That is, to some extent, people who really don't need to see this information couldn't see unmasked information. So working with our Elsevier platforms and software engineering team and our counterparts on the Aries EM team for system architecture, we devised a purpose-built publisher-neutral solution. And we do this by having the gender, race, and ethnicity, or GRE, data actually captured when somebody's logged into EM, but then the data is shuttled to a different system. Now, there are some linkages, but it's shuttled to another system so that from within EM itself, users and editors and even publishers and publishing directors can't see that diversity data. And this is really important. The data collection and storage is outside of Editorial Manager, which means that we can ensure that the user-reported or self-reported diversity data can't be seen or used in any part of a peer review process for manuscripts. And not only can it be done for Elsevier and society partner journals, but actually it's a system that's system architecture that's more than just publisher agnostic, it's platform agnostic. That is, Clarivate's Scholar One and Wiley's EJ Press can use the same appropriate, the same architecture. And this is what we've deployed. Now, what this also allows us to do is start to plan for the diversity data architecture and reporting. And the stage that we're at for reporting here is stage one, our ability to be able to report in aggregate, and we are getting to being able to report the data for a journal by journal basis. So at a journal level, which then allows us to aggregate in lots of different ways to examine each diversity dimension, gender, race, and ethnicity. And we're aiming within the next 6 to 8 weeks to be able to provide that data then parsed by role, so for authors, editors, and reviewers, and also by country. We also learned during our testing and all of the iteration that role and geography, so location, mattered in considerable ways. And these are areas and dimensions, not only gender, race, and ethnicity, but geographical diversity as well. So we've prioritized that. This platform architecture, though, allows us to develop even more sophisticated, and this will be our stage 2 reporting. This is what we're aiming to be able to do by the end of this year, and then continue build out our data reporting capabilities. So we will make available for all of our society partner journals any reporting capability that is available to Elsevier's own proprietary journals. All right, as I mentioned before, communication was really key for us and things that we said. So one of the concerns that was shared with us about comfort and representation was concerns about bias, prejudice, and even discrimination that could happen. So the platform and the approach that we've taken to the capturing of the self-reported data is that we can ensure that the data is not made available or linked to the evaluation of any individual manuscript submission systems. Now, we also discovered that we needed to be really clear as to why these data are being collected, who's going to gain access, and where they're going to be stored, and information within Editorial Manager with linkage to more information, essentially making sure that we have informed explicit consent, which is the basis on which GDPR will allow us to request and invite people to self-report their data. And then we also learned that that race is the most sensitive of the 3 diversity questions. And we needed to provide more robust explanation and justification with regards to race. And we also needed to think about things such as what we know is that hesitancy and hostility to diversity efforts or racial self-reporting. And then contextualize this effort so that it's not just, hey, we're doing this one thing, but there's lots of activities going on. So we did this, and we have a really robust communication plan, and we'll be sharing all of our resources with you as well, and then work with you to make sure that the communication out to your society members is very clear. So here was the initial press release from last June when Aries and Elsevier first launched this. On the Royal Society of Chemistry's joint commitment website. There's a tremendous amount of information, and including where we were very clear about what these schemas are not and the limitations of how we're using these schemas, and therefore they're different from things like the National Census Bureau schemas. In addition, as we began to roll the diversity data questions out across Elsevier's 1,700 plus journals, we started to get questions. We did also through the iterating process, and we now have an incredibly robust public-facing FAQ page. And this information you will be able to link and provide to all of the members of your journal community as well. This answers a tremendous number of questions with considerable detail for people to understand why we're asking the questions, how we develop these questions, and the nature of how the data is being used, and especially when it will not be made available. We spent a lot of time also thinking about the user experience and thinking about how these questions get asked. So you can see these are example screen captures of what it looks like when a user is logged into Editorial Manager and they're presented with the questions. Since we know that there was varying sensitivity to the three questions, our user experience colleagues advised that we actually ask the questions as individuals. So we don't have them all on the same page. We start with the least sensitive, gender identity, and move our way to race. Now, within the system, people can go back. The respondents can decide that by the time they get to the third question, they want to change and they want to select, I prefer not to disclose for all of them, or they can answer just the first two with an option and do prefer not to disclose for the third or any other kind of combination. This has actually mattered quite a bit, and we're really pleased with this, how this came out. But again, all of these issues of communication, they're within the system, they're in the FAQ document, they're in the way in which we did outreach to the research community when we launched this initiative. And then finally, at the end, people are told, thank you, thank you, thanks for working with us. And it's also a signpost that reminds them at any time they can change their data that they shared with us, and that data overrides previously reported data, so that I don't know, 2 minutes or 2 months later, people can go back and decide that they want to change everything to prefer not to disclose. It would completely overwrite the data that they have already self-reported. All right, and then there's additional resources. You will, as Steve noted at the beginning, you're going to get a recording of today's webinar and the accompanying slides. There is already also a public-facing Elsevier Connect reviewer update article, and we've provided email templates for responding to inquiries, concerns, complaints, and threats. And what we consider threats are, I'm leaving your board, I'm going to resign. Mostly we've had inquiries and concerns. We've had some complaints to date and a couple of threats, but overall pretty great. So we have all of these resources for you. So let me now show you, since on Elsevier's proprietary journals, we are coming up on a year from having introduced the 3 diversity data questions. Let me show you where we're at. Now, we don't yet have the journal level data reporting capability available yet, but we're working towards it. And so what I'm going to be showing you is just the aggregated for the 3 diversity questions across all of Elsevier journals. And this data is only 3 weeks old. We get once a month updates for this. We'll be looking to have more rapid updates, but for now it's on a monthly basis. So this is an overview of what we did. So Elsevier has about 1,700 proprietary or controlled journals, and this includes all of our journals within the Cell Press and the Lancet portfolios. And they have had all 3 diversity data questions implemented. We began the rollout last year, finished right at the very end. We had hoped to begin the society rollout at the end of last year, but there was some technical difficulties. So now we're doing it now, and we are working on making sure that you can have the same approach. Actually, should change this. We have over 4 million responses to each question to date, and the overall response rate has continued to be really high. With prefer not to disclose at a significantly lower rate than we might have expected. So let me show you some of that data. So here's the prefer not to disclose. And so you can see over time, we're looking to see as we were rolling it out, and we did it in a phased approach, as more people were hearing that we were doing this, was that going to produce any sort of large scale backlash? Were people all of a sudden going to, I don't know, leave the editorial boards or boycott publishing in Elsevier journals? So we wanted to just look at the trends of the prefer not to disclose, as well as some other indicators. What we see here is that the rate at which respondents are selecting the option prefer not to disclose, which also means that they don't have to disclose why they don't wish to, has remained pretty steady. Now, importantly, our diversity questions in the system are mandatory. So you can't skip the questions, but you can answer any one or two or all three of the questions with prefer not to disclose. And in part, this helps ensure that, especially for the reviewer role, people who are invited to review but decline, we want to know something about the diversity composition of those people relative to reviewers invited to review who accept to review as well. This was maybe part of our greatest concern, but overall, we think really good. And so you can see we're holding pretty steady at about 22% prefer not to disclose, which means 78% of people through race, all the way to 89% of respondents for gender identity are in fact disclosing their diversity data. And now if you just go back to a few slides ago where I told you when we did the testing and asked people about their level of comfort answering these, we saw that about 32% of people said they would not be comfortable reporting, which probably meant they wouldn't going to. So we see that this 22% is substantially lower than the 32% and much lower if you think about gender identity. And we always knew, and this just confirms, that race is more sensitive than our ethnic origin questions, than our gender identity. So this data now helps to reinforce or to have tested our hypotheses. Now, let me show you, these are the actual schemas that were endorsed that then got endorsed, and I'm going to show you some data specific to each one of the three questions. So there's the gender identity schema, the ethnicity schema, and the race schema. And for each one, you can see there's a specific question that was asked and a list of options, all ending with prefer not to disclose. Now, this also told us, as we were thinking about communication and user experience, my hypothesis was that you needed to have the prefer not to disclose as the first option so that the users were ensured of seeing that and could answer it if they didn't want to provide their diversity data. It turns out that it's better to make it the last thing. People tend to go to the last and closest to the next button on the page. So we really thought about communication throughout the entire life cycle of the user experience. And so you can see all of the options. For gender identity, it is a single option question, so you can only pick one. For both ethnic origins and race, they are multi-select options. And we learned through this process that, in fact, that was really essential. And it's funny because then we were clear about our communication about this. And then it turns out that once we made this multi-select and clearly communicated, people didn't actually need it. So just to show you some data, about over 4 million researchers have now answered these three mandatory diversity questions in the 1,735 Elsevier journals. And you can see over time the proportion of people who have answered and the total number rather of people who have answered these questions. This gives you overall across all of Elsevier's journals, the reporting on gender identity. So we see woman, man, and you can see here that people are in fact selecting the non-binary or gender diverse. It's a small percentage, but it's really important. And then you can see here the prefer not to disclose. Here we go, is that for ethnic origins and race, despite people telling us that they must have multi-option selection capability and that we clearly explain they do, most respondents are still picking a primary ethnic origin or race. So about close to 80% of people select only one option for ethnic origins and about 75% for a single race. So you can see just some of the composition that we've seen here in differences. All right, so this brings us now to all of your journals. You should have received, because our publishers sent a rollout announcement to their society journals on May 8th. If you did not receive the email a week ago, please get in touch. You can just put in the chat what your society or journals are, and we'll make sure that the communication, my apologies if somehow you slipped through the cracks. Today is the overall overview webinar, and then the diversity data questions will be officially implemented in all of our society partner journals on June 28th. At which point we will begin capturing that data and the ability to report on it in aggregate for the society titles starting the following month. Now, I do want to keep in mind that it will take some time to have data that's meaningful. We will not for your journals either be capturing data retrospectively. So it's only when users are now logging into Editorial Manager anew, they will be presented with the questions to answer. So there will be a little bit of a lag time from the rollout until the period when we will have some meaningful data to be able to share with you. But we believe at that point, so a few months from now, we will be able to do it on an individual journal level. And then for those of you with multiple journals that you publish with us, that we'll be able to provide an aggregate set of data for all of your journals as well. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to open it up for any questions that we may have, and be delighted to answer anything that that has come up.
Great, thanks, Holly. But very, very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, any questions, please send them through the chat function. We have had one already regarding opt-in, opt-out. Just to be clear, if for whatever reason you decide you do not want to participate in the diversity data, although we strongly encourage that you do, it is, of course, down to you, given that you own the journal, so it's your decision. And please do have that conversation with your publishers.
All right. And look, I appreciate that, and there's a little bit of concern. Look, on the first month we were rolling this out, I'm like, oh my God, did I just break like Elsevier's journal publishing business and I'm going to lose my job? Let me tell you, well, I said we have had some communications with questions and concerns and some complaints, and we had a couple of threats. We have had now a total of 3 associate editors who have resigned. Now, that's not 3 editorial boards. That's 3 associate editors across 1,735 journals. No editor-in-chief has resigned. And while we had one associate editor threaten to try to have the entire editorial board resign with him, the editor-in-chief said, no, thank you. And in fact, in that case, and a lot of communication to at least get the associate editor to just answer, prefer not to disclose, and move on with life, he just refused. And he was so adamantly opposed to the questions being asked that the editor-in-chief asked him to resign. So we've had 3 resignations of associate editors. Now, we have had some complaints on Twitter. We've addressed those very successfully within a business day to be able to bring the original poster, what we say, to a point of neutrality. That is, they stop complaining and they're satisfied with the information that we've provided. And then again, just understanding that of 4 million researchers who've logged in and have been provided these questions, we've got as high as 78% of them are answering the race, ethnicity, and gender questions. And if you just look at gender, 89% of respondents. This is a considerable amount of data. It's meaningful data that you can have evidentiary, data-informed action plans that are derived from this. So we'd really strongly encourage you to continue working with us and partner. We think that there's a tremendous amount of value add. Now, there may be some reasons why we can't, we've got some, but we'd really strongly encourage that you participate, that in fact, your members, the people who publish in your journals, the researchers, are going to find this a real asset and greater trust for you as a society and a journal overall.
Great, thanks, Holly. A couple of questions in. So for society journals, will society get access to data, or will society just get an overall report? Can we request specific reports or just get a general report?
All right, so at first it's going to be general reports. So what you're going to receive is at a journal level, you're going to receive the aggregated data, so gender, ethnic origins, and race. And then we'll be able to first work by parsing that by role and geography. And then the stage 2 or our phase 2 of reporting capabilities, when those get built up. That's going to be in the form of a dashboard, and that dashboard will be directly accessible by your publisher. And we will be setting up, we've had a working group to define a whole set of standardized reports that we'll be able to ultimately provide. And yes, then we will be able to accept requests for developing specific kinds of reports. Now, in terms of the unmasked or identifiable data, we actually will be incredibly careful with that. There are some use cases that are defined and that we can provide the journal with unmasked data, but that will be on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, what's being provided will be the aggregated and de-identified data. This is really important in terms of the trust and both the privacy and security of the user's data, as this isn't regularly available, and importantly, need to ensure that the identifiable data is never available or seen at any step of the manuscript submission process. Now, when would be an appropriate use case? Somebody complains that there was discrimination on the basis of race of their article. At that point, yes, we would then provide the publisher and society partner with unmasked data to be able to assess whether or not that concern was in fact tied to the data. If in fact there's problems of being able to identify a significant amount of diverse pool of new editorial board members, we can provide a list of reviewers who have participated with the journal and be able to show that by gender, race, and ethnicity so that the journal can consider how best to broaden that pool. So those are a couple of use cases where we will be able to, but it'll be by request, and we will be carefully monitoring those to protect the privacy and security of users' data.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Holly. So I think, Zoe, I think you're keen to answer this one. We've had another one come in. If we implement the diversity schemas in EM and have other APD queries, will it be seamless experience for users, one questionnaire, or will there be a separate set of APD queries, the diversity schema, and other custom questions presented? So Zoe, if you're happy to answer that one.
I do not have the answer.
Oh, I can do that.
I think for the next.
Holly,
I'm like, Zoe's about to send it
Thanks.
to me, no problem. Yeah, so here's the thing is no, they will be separate. The fact is that we really needed to ensure that the personal and sensitive personal information is kept separate from that. Now, ultimately, downstream, we're going to look to then be able to parse data and combine the diversity data questions and anything else asked in APD. And so this is, right, we identified the top ones, so role and geography, and we'll parse the gender, race, and ethnicity by that. We've got a list of other denominators, if you will, other ways that we want to be able to parse it. So your publisher and Aries can work in thinking about what are your other APD questions and how do you want to use that as information that can parse the diversity data questions.
Great, thank you. Another question through, who exactly will receive the notification reports? Does it just go to the editorial board members or the contact in the professional body admin team as well? I won't go to the detail. I have no direct contact with the editorial boards, and so would I need to connect with the individual board members?
Yeah, so we are going to make this up to the societies and how. What's going to happen is that the publishers will provide their primary contact with these reports. And it may be that the society makes a decision for some period of time. They just want to keep this to yourselves. You can immediately then share these with your editor-in-chief, which is what I'm going to recommend, that as soon as you have the data, is to share it as broadly as possible. Even if at first, it's not with a requirement or even a request to change what anybody is doing, but to start to get people accustomed to the idea of thinking about diversity on editorial boards and desensitizing them where people may have strong initial reactions or objections to this. So sharing the data and providing these reports, which provides some assurance of, it's not going to be a massive number of people who are going to refuse to review. You're not going to see that the journal all of a sudden stops getting submissions from authors. And we don't anticipate that editorial boards are going to resign over having these questions. So sharing this, and we'll be able to continue to share the Elsevier level data as well. So you'll be able to benchmark your journal by comparison with all Elsevier journals, and we'll have Elsevier proprietary, Elsevier plus society, we'll have all society in aggregate, and then you'll have your individual journal or journal portfolio data. And so you'll be able to share that, but it will be at the society's discretion. We will not be distributing it to publishers. We leave those decisions, like others, in your hands because they are your journals. Our goal is to be able to provide you with the greatest amount of diversity data for you to have these conversations, set goals, and then be able to evaluate your progress towards goals to the very greatest extent that we can. And doing it in exactly the same way as Elsevier is doing it for our proprietary journals.
Great, thanks, Holly. So I'm mindful of a couple of the questions, Eva and JCAT person. Sorry, I'm not familiar with your name.
So we will
come back to you afterwards.
Yeah, we will. Yeah. So Zoe, if you just grab that, we'll talk with you about that and any other questions. So not to worry.
Yeah, great, brilliant. Now we're very close to coming to an end. So Holly, thanks very much. Any other questions? If not, I will close out the meeting. But I do need to do a poll because I always forget to do it. So I'm going to launch the poll unless there's any final questions. So let me just do this poll. Here we go. You should be able to see the poll now. So the question, has this webinar helped your understanding of how Elsevier is helping to create a more inclusive research ecosystem? Yes, a lot. Yes, a little. No. Great. So I'm going to end the poll now. Yeah, so yes, a lot is 70%. Yes, a little, or 30%. No is 0%. So overall, pretty good. As we've mentioned, please do reach out to your publisher, have further conversations. We're happy to help as needed and answer any additional questions that you have. So do reach out to them. Anything to add, Holly? If not, we'll close the meeting.
No, that's it. And feel free, you will get a copy of the slides. So email addresses are going to be there. Please feel free to reach out to your publisher. And if there's any additional questions, including should you need to have much more information or you'd like to have a phone call, I'm very happy to set up a Zoom meeting if needed.
Great, thanks, Holly. And just a quick plug, we have another Society webinar next Tuesday, 23rd of May, on the future of research. So do join that one if you can. There should be a very interesting webinar. But with that, Holly, many thanks for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining. Thanks very much indeed. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much.